BRYAN KOHBERGER is serving 4 life sentences at Idaho's maximum security institution, and adjusting to life on J-Block has not been easy for him. He has filed grievances about missing fruit from his meals and inmates taunting him by yelling through the vents. Dr. Orr diagnosed BRYAN KOHBERGER with the following: autism spectrum disorder level 1 without accompanying intellectual or language impairment, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, combined presentation in partial remission, obsessive compulsive disorder with absent insight, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARFID. Now, ARFID is an eating disorder. The Cleveland Clinic defines ARFID as a disorder that causes a person to limit the amount of food that he or she eats. It is not the same as simply being a picky eater. Now, what causes ARFID isn't known, but the clinic says it could be the result of anxiety, fear, genetic changes, social, cultural, and environmental influences, or even trauma. Dr. Orr said that KOHBERGER had been diagnosed with several things in the past, including developmental coordination disorder, anorexia nervosa, binge eating, and the purging type. She said that was in complete remission, though.
Finally, the news we all have been waiting to hear. Unsealed court documents are revealing something investigators, prosecutors, and the public have never seen before: the private psychological file on convicted killer BRYAN KOHBERGER. For months, this evaluation sat sealed, hidden from public view, locked away inside a courthouse while a grieving community tried to move forward, believing the worst of this case was finally behind them. Now it's out. And inside it, a defense-hired psychologist who spent hours across from KOHBERGER describes a man who broke rules during testing, rushed through tasks meant to measure his own mind, and at one point turned to her and said flatly, "I'll tell you when I'm done." This is the file his own lawyers didn't want the world to see. Welcome. We cover the true stories behind the headlines, the psychology, the investigations, and what happens to the people left standing long after the cameras move on to the next story. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The evaluation didn't begin with cameras or courtrooms. It began quietly, behind closed doors, months before any of it would reach the public. In late 2024, a neuropsychologist named Dr. Rachel Orr was brought onto BRYAN KOHBERGER's defense team. Her role wasn't to determine guilt or innocence. That question had already been settled in the eyes of the law, sealed the moment KOHBERGER stood in a courtroom and confirmed, out loud, that he was responsible. Her task was narrower, and in many ways, far more difficult. To sit across from a man convicted of taking 4 lives, session after session, and try to understand how his mind actually worked, beneath the headlines that had already decided who he was. At the time, KOHBERGER's attorneys and the prosecution were locked in a quiet but consequential dispute. His defense team wanted any psychological findings to serve as a mitigating factor, a piece of context that could weigh in his favor in a case where his life itself was on the table. Prosecutors viewed the same information differently, as something that could be used against him instead, evidence of a mind that understood precisely what it was doing. Caught in the middle of that disagreement was Dr. Orr, tasked with producing an evaluation that would go on to become one of the most detailed windows into KOHBERGER's psychology ever made public. Neither side could have known, at the time, that her work would still be shaping this case more than a year later, long after the plea deal that was supposed to bring it to a close. Over the following months, she met with him 6 separate times, spread across roughly 3 months, ending in February of 2025. These weren't brief conversations. Each session involved structured testing, direct dialogue, and careful observation, the kind of process built to strip away performance and reach something closer to how a person actually thinks, reacts, and moves through the world. 6 sessions. Hours spent in a small room with a man the public had already reduced to a single word, trying to find out whether that word was the whole story or only part of one. By the end of those 6 sessions, Dr. Orr had reached 4 primary diagnoses: autism spectrum disorder, Level 1, a classification for individuals who function at a high level without accompanying intellectual or language impairment. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, combined presentation, noted as being in partial remission. Obsessive compulsive disorder, described in her notes as OCD, with limited insight, meaning Kohberger did not always recognize his own compulsive patterns as unusual. And ARFID, a disorder that causes a person to severely limit the types or amount of food they're willing to eat, often driven by anxiety or rigid behavioral patterns rather than concerns about appearance. Her evaluation also looked backward into a version of Kohberger that existed long before that name meant anything to anyone outside his own family. Through records, family interviews, and his own account, she identified 4 additional conditions from his past, each now considered to be in remission: a developmental coordination disorder affecting motor skills, a documented history of an eating disorder involving anorexia, an unspecified depressive disorder, and a past dependency on opioids connected to an addiction he developed as a teenager, now classified as being in sustained remission. Somewhere inside that history is a teenager who was struggling quietly, years before any of the rest of this began. It changes nothing about what came after. But it's part of the fuller picture this evaluation was built to capture, and it's a reminder that the story of who someone becomes rarely begins on the day the world starts paying attention. 8 conditions in total, 4 shaping who he is now, 4 belonging to who he was before. Together, they form the foundation of a report that would go on to describe, in careful, granular detail, exactly how these patterns showed up across the sessions themselves, turning clinical shorthand into something closer to a portrait of a man very few people had actually spent time with. Because a diagnosis on paper is one thing. What the evaluation captured next was something else entirely: real, observed behavior, recorded across 6 sessions, moment by moment, almost like watching the same pattern surface again and again, refusing to stay contained. Dr. Orr wrote that impulsive tendencies were present throughout the evaluation. This wasn't a single passing comment. It was something she documented repeatedly, session after session. During structured testing, the kind of standardized tasks used to measure memory, focus, and processing speed, Kohberger didn't always wait for instructions to finish. He would begin tasks early. He would turn pages himself before being told to. In some instances, this rushed approach didn't just reflect impatience, it compromised the reliability of the results themselves, forcing a trained clinician to work around a subject who seemed almost unable to let a process run its natural course, even when that process existed specifically to help him. That same pattern extended into how he communicated, and it's here that the evaluation begins to feel less like a clinical file and more like a quiet, unsettling window into something harder to name. At one point, during a routine check-in where Dr. Orr asked whether there was anything further he wanted to add, his response was brief. He told her, "I'll tell you when I'm done." 4 words. No elaboration, no softening. Dr. Orr didn't record this as a throwaway comment. She flagged the moment specifically, noting it as an example of reduced social awareness, a moment where Kohberger appeared unaware or unconcerned with how a directive like that might land on the very person conducting an evaluation that could shape whether he lived out his remaining years in a cell or faced something far more final. Sit with that for a moment. A man whose fate was still, at that point, genuinely uncertain, speaking not with urgency, not with the fear you might expect from someone trying to make his case to the one professional standing between him and the harshest outcome the state could offer, but with the flat, quiet authority of someone who believed the room and the moment belonged to him regardless. It's a small exchange, only a handful of words, but within the structure of a clinical evaluation, small exchanges carry weight far beyond their length. They're not incidental. They're data points, carefully recorded because they reveal something a diagnosis alone cannot. How a person actually behaves when the shape of a conversation doesn't go the way they expected it to, when someone else is, for once, asking the questions. And it wasn't only Dr. Orr's own observations that supported this picture. Her evaluation drew from a wider circle, including direct conversations with Kohberger's mother and his sister, people who had loved him the longest, who had watched him grow from a child into the man now sitting inside a maximum security facility. What they described lined up closely with what Dr. Orr had already documented in session. According to their accounts, Kohberger often failed to register when his own behavior affected the people around him. Not, they were careful to say, out of intent, not out of malice. Rather, something closer to a blind spot, a consistent difficulty recognizing the emotional weight of his own words or actions, even when that weight was obvious to everyone else standing in the room. Try to imagine being his mother in that interview, answering those questions honestly, trying to describe a son she has loved his entire life, while also acknowledging patterns she may have noticed for years and never fully understood, never imagined would one day be read into a court record connected to the deaths of 4 young people. Taken together, the picture that emerges from these 6 sessions is not chaotic or contradictory. It's remarkably consistent, impulsive during testing, prone to breaking structure, even in low-stakes tasks that carried no real consequence either way. Direct to the point of bluntness, with little apparent awareness of how that directness registered with the people around him. And according to those who had known him the longest, this wasn't new behavior, wasn't something incarceration or the pressure of a capital case had produced. By every account gathered in the report, it was simply who he had always been. That single detail might be the most haunting thread running through this entire evaluation. Not that prison changed him, but that, by every measure available, it didn't. Before we continue, a quick reminder. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, subscribing helps this channel keep covering cases like this with the depth and care they deserve. It only takes a second, and it means we can keep bringing you updates like this one as soon as the facts are confirmed, not months later, once the story has already moved on. Not everything that surfaced in the days following the release of this evaluation has held up equally well under scrutiny. When a document like this becomes public, especially one attached to a case this closely watched, reporting moves fast. Sometimes faster than every detail inside it can be independently confirmed. And in a story already carrying this much weight, for a case this many people have followed for years, the line between what's proven and what's simply assumed starts to matter more than ever. One claim involves how certain sessions were reportedly interrupted. According to one account that circulated in early coverage, there were instances where Kohberger would abruptly bring a session to a stop, indicating that he needed to step away immediately, with no clear signal beforehand that anything of the sort was coming. If accurate, it would represent another data point inside the broader pattern Dr. Orr had already documented elsewhere in her evaluation: difficulty operating inside structure that wasn't entirely his own to control. But this particular detail, as specific as it sounds, has not been something we could confirm word for word across multiple major news organizations. Some outlets referenced it, others left it out entirely, and without direct access to that exact section of the underlying report ourselves, we can't say with certainty that this account reflects precisely what Dr. Orr wrote, or how she wrote it. That distinction matters, and it matters more here than it might in almost any other story. In a case already surrounded by this much public attention, and now shadowed by a legal fight over whether a formal guilty plea should even stand, the gap between a confirmed clinical finding and a single unverified account of one is not a small gap to overlook. So we're presenting this exactly as it was first described, as one account among the early reporting on this evaluation, not as an established, multiply-sourced fact. If it turns out to be accurate to the document itself, it fits neatly into everything else Dr. Orr documented. If it doesn't hold up under further scrutiny, the broader pattern she described elsewhere in her evaluation still stands entirely on its own, without needing this particular detail to support it. The rushed testing, the rule violations during structured tasks, the difficulty letting a session run its intended course. Those findings remain documented, sourced, and consistent, regardless of whether this one additional detail proves accurate. There's a second point worth addressing here, and it comes not from the evaluation itself, but from the public commentary that grew up around it once the report became known. Kohberger has, for some time, been publicly associated with following a vegan diet. That fact isn't in dispute. Given that Dr. Orr's evaluation includes a diagnosis of ARFID, some legal commentators discussing the case have raised the possibility that these two things might be connected, that his dietary restrictions, publicly known for years, might tie directly into the clinical picture Dr. Orr was building. It's an understandable question to ask. On the surface, the two pieces of information seem to sit together neatly, but it's important to say clearly that this connection does not appear anywhere in the evaluation itself. Dr. Orr's report does not draw a line between his dietary choices and his ARFID diagnosis. That link exists only in commentary made after the fact, by people analyzing the case from the outside, not by the clinician who actually spent 6 sessions with him. So while it remains a theory worth acknowledging, given how often it's circulated in discussion of this case, it should be understood for exactly what it is: a theory. Not a documented finding, not something stated anywhere in the report. An inference, drawn by observers, from two facts that happen to sit near each other, without any confirmation that they're actually related at all. What both of these examples reveal, whether they end up being confirmed or not, is something worth sitting with honestly. This is a case where every fragment of new information is being picked apart in real time, examined from every possible angle, repeated across dozens of platforms within hours of release. Some of what circulates will hold up under scrutiny, some of it won't. And it's worth remembering that for the families connected to this case, every unverified detail that spreads is another version of the story they may feel compelled to correct, another wave of attention pulling them back into a moment they never chose to relive in the first place. As BRYAN KOHBERGER's petition to withdraw his guilty plea continues moving through the courts, it's likely that more of this evaluation and more details from the broader case file will surface in the months ahead, some of it confirmed, some of it contested. All of it worth examining with care, rather than accepting at first glance, because behind every headline in this case are real people who are still, in one way or another, learning how to carry what happened. A diagnosis is not the same thing as a legal defense. That distinction sits at the very center of everything legal experts have said since Dr. Orr's evaluation became public, and it's worth pausing on. Because in a case this psychologically detailed, it becomes easy to start looking for an explanation that feels like it should count for more than the law actually allows it to. Legal analysts who've reviewed the situation, speaking to outlets including CNN and USA Today, have not minced words about where this leaves Kohberger. He faces what multiple experts have independently described as a steep, uphill battle, and that phrase isn't being used loosely. It reflects a very specific legal reality. The diagnoses themselves aren't the problem. Nobody, including prosecutors, is disputing what Dr. Orr found across those 6 sessions. The autism, the ADHD, the OCD, the ARFID, none of it is being challenged as inaccurate or fabricated. The issue sits somewhere else entirely, in a much narrower legal space that Kohberger's new legal team now has to navigate carefully. To understand why this matters so much, it helps to understand what courts actually require before they'll agree to reopen a guilty plea that's already been formally accepted. It isn't enough to show that a defendant struggled with attention, or leaned toward rigid thinking, or had difficulty reading certain social situations. Those things, however real, however clinically documented across an entire evaluation, don't rise to the level the law demands. The standard set by decades of legal precedent requires something far more severe, evidence pointing toward a fundamental inability to understand what was actually happening during the legal proceedings themselves, at the precise moment those proceedings were taking place. And according to every legal expert who has weighed in publicly, nothing inside Dr. Orr's evaluation comes close to meeting that bar. If anything, her own findings work directly against that argument. Kohberger was, by the account of his own defense-hired specialist, someone who understood complex language, who could follow structured, multi-step processes, who functioned at a level high enough to complete graduate-level academic work, someone who spent years studying the very justice system he now finds himself moving through as a defendant rather than a student. That reality, laid out clearly within his own evaluation, becomes one of the most difficult obstacles standing between Kohberger and any successful argument that he simply didn't understand the plea he entered. And it raises a question that has quietly followed this case since the very beginning. If he understood the system this well, what does it mean that he still chose, in that courtroom, to say the word guilty at all? While legal analysts weigh in from the outside, the case itself continues to move forward on a formal track. On August 3, 2026, an Idaho attorney named Gregory Rausch was officially assigned to represent Kohberger going forward. His role is specific. He's now responsible for taking the claims Kohberger first raised in his own handwritten petition, written alone from inside a maximum security facility, and shaping them into arguments capable of withstanding real legal scrutiny in front of a judge. This shift matters more than it might first appear. Up until this point, Kohberger's fight to withdraw his plea existed largely in his own words, scrawled by hand in a cell, without the structure, strategy, or resources of a formal legal team behind it. Now, with Rauch's appointment, that changes entirely. This becomes a structured legal proceeding, backed by representation, moving through the system the way any serious post-conviction petition would. Whether Dr. Orr's evaluation becomes a central pillar of that strategy, or a supporting piece alongside broader claims of ineffective counsel and a coerced confession, is something that will likely become clearer as new filings begin to emerge. Not everyone connected to this case is simply watching from a distance as the legal process unfolds. The Goncalves family, who lost Kaylee in the deaths inside that Moscow, Idaho home, has already spoken publicly about the possibility that this case could be reopened. Their statement was brief, but unmistakably direct. They said their family is prepared, regardless of how this process ultimately plays out. And they expressed clear confidence in one particular outcome, that if the case is reopened and moves back toward trial, prosecutors will once again pursue the death penalty, an outcome that became impossible the moment Kohberger's original guilty plea was formally accepted by the court. There's something worth sitting with in that statement, in the quiet steadiness of a family who has already endured more than most people will ever be asked to carry, saying, in effect, that they are ready to go through all of it again if that's what justice ultimately requires of them. That single statement captures something essential about where this case currently stands, and why it continues to draw so much attention from people who never knew any of those involved. For BRYAN KOHBERGER, this petition represents a chance, however narrow, to challenge the very outcome that spared him from execution, a chance to rewrite the ending he agreed to in open court just over a year ago. For the families of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, it represents something entirely different. The possibility that a resolution they had allowed themselves to call closure could be pulled back open, forcing them to relive a legal process many of them believed, or at least hoped, had finally ended for good. A formal petition, now backed by legal representation rather than handwritten alone, is expected in the months ahead. When it's filed, it will almost certainly draw on everything examined throughout this evaluation: the diagnoses, the documented behavior across 6 sessions, and the deeper legal question that experts have already begun answering. Whether any of it is enough to change a decision that was made under oath in open court more than a year ago by a man who looked directly at a judge and confirmed that he was guilty because he was. We'll continue following this case closely as it develops, carefully, and only with information we can stand behind. If you want to be here the moment the next update breaks, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this story isn't over, and neither is the waiting for the people who loved Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan. And before you go, we want to hear from you directly in the comments. Do you think a psychological evaluation like this one should carry any weight in a case that's already been legally decided? Or does new information like this change the picture entirely?